Hi, I'm Meredith McGill. I'm co-leading with Colin Yeager this year's CCA seminar. Robert Nichols, our guest today, is associate professor at the University of Minnesota in the Twin Cities, where he specializes in political theory and the history of political thought. He's been a research fellow at the Humboldt University in Berlin and has held academic posts at the École des Hautes Études at the university and also at the University of Alberta, the Cambridge University, and Columbia University. I first became aware of his work through a 2018 article in Political Theory that distills the argument of his 2020 book. I still think it's new, Theft is Property. In this book, Nichols describes dispossession as a recursive process through which property relations are constituted. In Nichols' account, theft is prior to and indispensable to propertization, which in the case of the indigenous peoples of North America means that property rights are conveyed only so that they can be stolen. Native Americans are identified only retroactively as the owners of lands that have been taken from them. So with that brief introduction, I want to hand things over to Robert to let him give some opening remarks, and then I'll keep my eye on the chat. And I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Thanks. It's over to you, Robert.
Well, yeah, I very much appreciate the opportunity to be here and have a chance to chat with you a little bit about what I've been trying to think through for the last little while. I won't say a whole lot at the beginning because I'm kind of more interested in what you think and getting into the conversation. I did think maybe it would be useful to position myself a little bit kind of personally in how I came to this project as a way of kind of foregrounding, I think, the stakes of it for me and for us. Because I think that that's important, as well as the kind of internal composition of the argument, the sort of why question it matters. So I'm speaking to you from Minneapolis, Minnesota. I'm on Dakota lands here, and I've worked here for about 5 years, but I'm originally from Canada. I was telling Colin before we got started that I'm from a very small rural community in the northern kind of half of the province of Alberta in Western Canada. And so I grew up kind of surrounded by a number of small indigenous reservations. That's Cree land. I'm from Treaty 6 territory, which is the governing architecture for the legal relationship between the Canadian state and the indigenous nations there. But the thing that's most relevant, that if you know anything about Alberta, you probably know that it's the place where the tar sands are. So Canada has about the third largest proven oil and gas reserves in the world, and about 98% of that are held in the form of tar sands or bituminous oil, which is in the northern part of Alberta where I'm from. And that means it's an incredibly dense site of contestation around environmental concerns. You know, bituminous oil is extremely difficult to extract and process. It has much higher carbon emission rates through that whole process than even ordinary or conventional oil. So it's a kind of very dense site of environmental activism and contestation around the use and transformation of the land and the earth. But it's also central to indigenous struggles, because there are these indigenous communities that live on these lands and have contesting and mutually incompatible claims to it vis-a-vis the Canadian state and the corporations that are trying to extract the oil. It's also the oil that comes from there flows through the pipelines, which are being built across North America, across the United States. So here in Minnesota, we're fighting over the Dakota Access Pipeline. You're aware of the Standing Rock. You're aware of maybe of Line 3, which has just been started here. The oil that's flowing through those pipelines comes from where I'm from, comes from Alberta. So it's a site of contestation and indigenous politics, both at the source, but also through the transportation and the building of this kind of grid of pipelines across the continent. But in all of this, I also notice, has sort of with my political theory kind of goggles on, I could see that the kinds of arguments that are deployed in these contestations often oscillate back and forth between at least two main different registers. That on the one hand, they sometimes take the form of claims around care and a sort of fiduciary relationship, that the earth is a kind of living set of relationships that we have obligations to in the form of duty or duty relations or care relations, and that the earth is not to be thought of as a possession or property of any one individual or group of individuals. And so that's a kind of common and dominant grammar of struggle within these contexts. but the other is the language of property and possession and theft and eminent domain and expropriation and dispossession. So like, you know, the part of the reason why the book starts with the phrase "no justice on stolen land" is that's a really common kind of everyday language that's used in these contexts to leverage both a critique, but also to express a very, I think, visceral, real, experiential sense that the land has been, in a sense, stolen or taken from these people, that they see themselves as the victims of a form of expropriation or theft or some kind of appropriation of sorts. So really the project began from my sense that these two grammars were really dominant and important for these struggles, but that they don't intuitively mesh together exactly. And that it was unclear to me exactly how one could have them both at the same time, whether they could hang together. And initially my thought was that, well, Indigenous peoples just sort of strategically use the language of theft. It's more a rhetorical trope. They don't sort of really mean that. It's just because our system of law tends to understand or reinterpret claims in that parlance. And so it was merely a sort of strategic use of a vocabulary and not really intrinsic to the actual claims making underneath. So in other words, to resolve the apparent contradiction between the two claims, one could simply drop one or the other of them, or one doesn't really mean to hold both at the same time. They're just kind of strategically used. But the book really starts with the intuition that there might be a way actually of holding both of these claims at the same time. But it would depend upon first establishing that there are certain empirical conditions that held place, that under certain empirical conditions, it would actually make sense to say both that the earth is not property and that it has been stolen. And those conditions would be such that the property relations that were being contested were generated in such a way as to systematically divest the property from one party to another, while simultaneously sort of propertyizing the object in question. So one purpose of the book is to kind of reconstruct that as a theoretically or a plausible account. Second objective is to demonstrate that the empirical conditions under which that argument would be effective do obtain. That's not merely a counterfactual scenario or a kind of hypothetical, but is an actual empirical process. And then third, to kind of reconstruct why, for many of us who are not Indigenous and coming out of other European critical traditions, why that seems counterintuitive to us. Like why haven't we noticed this already? If this is so important to understanding, for instance, the entirety of the 19th century, why is this kind of counterintuitive? And so I also try to reconstruct a little bit of the alternative uses and origins of the concepts of dispossession and expropriation in European political thought as a way of explaining why the problem arises in the first place, why the blockage for us to not be able to see that there is a distinct use of the concept in the context of Indigenous struggles. So that's a sort of third objective in the book.
I wonder if I was really intrigued to hear a little bit more, Robert, if we can even start there about your thinking about the commons, which isn't exactly the same as public property. We've begun to think hard about how, to the extent to which the commons presumes that backdrop of propertization that you're trying to get us to look more carefully at as a process. I wonder if you could speak directly to your thinking about the commons in relation to this history you unfold for us.
In some of the literature I have seen on these topics, they evince a overly formal understanding of these questions. So by that, I mean that there is a tendency sometimes to think that the formal characteristics of a property relation is itself the problem. So in other words, whether it is private, whether it is public, whether it is common, whether it is individualized, that is the nature of the problem. And so if we change the form of the property, then then it will follow from that the politics will be changed. And well, I think that formal qualities of property relations matter. It's not that they're irrelevant. They certainly mediate the kind of power relations. I, generally speaking, methodologically speaking, I'm less concerned with the question of like what form of property is good or bad or right or wrong, and more concerned with how different formal configurations mediate different power relationships. And so the question for us, I think, should be not what is the right form, but rather what does this form do in this particular context? And that is a methodological point in part, because it means in order to answer that question, we need to know something about the historical and sociological conditions that in a sense actualize that property form, rather than solving it at a kind of like philosophical level that, well, individualized property is bad, therefore collectivized property is good, is going to be naive and mistaken if it doesn't look to how that's kind of actualized in practice, because every property form can instantiate forms of violence and domination over communities depending on how it's kind of put into practice, right? With regard to the whole long history of the invocations of the commons, then, I'm less concerned with a kind of uncritical veneration or celebration or return to notions of commonness, and more concerned with the variability of that as a mode of mediating property relations and what it does in different contexts. So one example that I point to just peripherally in the book is to just highlight that in the whole long history of, say, English colonization of the North America, one of the first steps of that whole process, right, with Locke, is precisely to assert a commonness, to say, well, if all of the world is in common, which means it is open to appropriation to whomever is best able to appropriate it in such a way as to maximize the common stock of mankind, which can be developed out of that commons. And it's these indigenous peoples precisely who are not maximizing the use of it, and therefore are taking more than they more than is owed to them. And so the kind of invocation of the commons in that way is a means by which to, in a sense, erase and obliterate previously existing political and social relations, of trying to set the, wipe the slate clean, and say, well, now because all the world is in common, then we could start from there and build kind of new relations of expropriation out of it. So that's just, one historical example, but I think it matters. And I think that indigenous peoples today, sometimes when they hear peoples talk about a kind of return to the commons, they hear it as, again, a sort of overlaying a kind of claim about open access and free access for all peoples, irrespective of these differential power asymmetries and histories of use that have been accumulated over time in and through those spaces. So that's the kind of methodological kind of starting point I take, and the political cautionary tale that I have in the back of my head when I'm trying to think through these questions.
One of the things I appreciated, and I was very struck by, was how upfront you are on the focused framing and keeping this within a kind of Anglo-settler tradition, and Anglophone colonies and Anglo legal tradition. And I'm just curious if you can talk a bit more about how and why you made that choice, and what you think it would look like, or even what would need to happen for other scholars to take this work into different European colonial traditions. Especially, I think, Iberian ones. It would be fascinating to see what happens.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, it's a good question. And it's a question I get a lot, and because people naturally want to kind of think through how to extrapolate beyond the specific context that I was thinking about. So partially it's just strategic on my part, based on my expertise, kind of both where I've come from, literally, but also my training and my expertise, that I'm much more familiar with kind of late modern. I would even say the story I tell here is intentionally emphasizing kind of from the early 19th century forward, because of the particular way that private property and homesteading plays a really central role in this. So I do not mean to, or don't intend to be saying that dispossession is kind of the phenomenon that explains English colonization in general, let alone not European colonization in all its kind of different ways, right? And even in the same location, the specific way in which I'm using the term dispossession may take hold for a period of time, but then be, interact with or competing with other forms of propertyization and so on. So I am trying at least to keep it fairly focused. I am writing more, I suppose you could say, a genealogical kind of work, in the sense that it starts with a contemporary concern that's very particular to the grammar of dispossession, but the sort of dilemma of dispossession. And I'm trying to trace retrospectively the origins of that problem. So although it does move in a kind of forward moving manner, the point is to actually be telling a retrospective tale of how the conceptual problem of dispossession arises in the present for us, so that I can kind of reframe that dilemma and show that it's not the sort of dilemma we think it is. We think it's merely a logical inconsistency of holding two claims. And I want to say it's not so much a logical incompatibility as a kind of very peculiar form of counterintuitive form of property generating theft that arises in a particular historical context, so that the parameters of it are chosen for that reason as much as anything. Other people I've been in conversation with have been telling me a lot about how glimpses of this do appear, this sort of particular thing do appear in the Spanish context in certain times and places, and even in unexpectedly in some of more, I would say, in kind of settler colonial contexts, like in South Africa with Boers, for instance, or in some French, like the Pied Noir in Algeria, because of the particular role that private property relations take when there is this added problem of like settlers who overrun the formal capacity of the state. And there ends up being this kind of unusual dynamic relationship between the formal claims of the state, often through treaties and negotiated agreements, and then the excess capacity of settlers to overrun and exceed that and sort of actualize those state-making practices in new ways through private property relations and privatized claims. So that's the context in which most people have shown me where, outside of an Anglo context, something of this sort can take hold for different periods of time. But I'm not enough of an expert to be able to elaborate extensively on those other examples.
Just, I guess, a question that I'd love to just hear you kind of speculate about, in its baldest form, would go something like, do you have to have a theory of human nature in order to think through the kind of normative end of these questions of dispossession? Winstanley, like Locke, says at the beginning the earth was in common. But he draws, of course, radically different conclusions from that premise. I suppose, in a way, it's kind of the problem of conjectural history. We were once upon a time like this, we humans, and we don't have any evidence for that. But we kind of, right, we tell a story, or we kind of get leverage on the story we want to tell about the present by reconstructing an imaginative or imaginary past. Absent that, and I take it that would come under the kind of umbrella of your critique of something being overly formal. Absent that, I wonder where one locates the kind of normative dimension of this argument.
One of the things I take from the Hegelian Marxist tradition is that formal characteristics can't be entirely divorced from questions of content, right? And that one common mistake we make is conflating those. The point of that is that not that we should kind of like not care about formal characteristics of property or commodity forms, but rather that one must be careful to not re-perform the conflation that Marx and Engels are criticizing, which is to conflate the general form of it with how it's being actualized here and now, right? And so that's a slightly different claim, I think, than the second point that you were making, which has to do with kind of like the normative leverage. So what's the wrongness of that? What's the kind of normative leverage that one can gain from this? And there, I think, yeah, I think we're in agreement that there is at least two different kind of ways in which one can leverage a normative critique in this sort. And I talk a little bit about this in the third chapter that's on Indigenous structural critique, because I try to point out there that the Indigenous communities in question often leverage at least two different kinds of normative critiques. One of them is like what you're referring to as a kind of almost like a philosophical anthropology, or like an alternative utopian kind of conception, which I describe it there as a form of life critique. That is, we have some alternative way of organizing human life, and we think it's superior. We think it actually is normatively better, normatively more defensible. It embodies better values and principles, which better actualize. If you really wanted to push it, you could say the essence of humans, or the whatever kind of strong, if you want to put it to the strongest way possible, one could say there's a strong universal philosophical anthropology undergirding that kind of critique. And so their claim is that European capitalist civilization is a kind of alienated form of, species being or something, right? And that their forms of life better actualize that. Without in any way wanting to preclude the possibility of making an argument of that sort, that's not the kind of argument that I'm trying to make. It's not the sort of argument. Mine is much more of the form of an immanent critique, which is to say that there are embedded in our existing institutions certain norms and values and principles. And I'm trying to demonstrate how, in a sense, we are in contradiction with ourselves. There's an internal contradiction, and that internal contradiction generates crises of legitimation and crises of reproduction of that form. In the most obvious way that takes in the case of dispossession. What I'm trying to say is that our continued use of the word dispossession is symptomatic of a kind of immanent contradiction within our form of legal relations, namely that we espouse principles of the rule of law and property, but we do so on the basis of systematic theft, a violation of our own norms of property, that our legal system is generated through coercive expropriation. And so it's embedded in the institutions. It's embedded in even in the concept of landed property in this context. And that's a different normative leverage for the critique. And in no way, I don't think these two things have to be incompatible. A person or a community, as I mentioned in kind of chapter 3, could oscillate back and forth, toggle back and forth between these two, because they're not in principle incompatible forms of criticism, but they are different forms of criticism. And the form of life one requires a pretty large philosophical architecture, which because I'm humble enough to think I'm not at the stage where I'm going to be able to provide that. I'm trying deliberately to eschew that for my own project, while recognizing that someone might want to do that, and that in fact many of these communities in a way are kind of performatively doing that work by sort of showing or modeling us an alternative form of life, even if I'm not trying to kind of highlight that as it's not my original contribution to be speaking to that, right?
I think I'm going to stick on like a similar theme, which is kind of on the question of your contribution to thinking about dispossession and its specific historical context in settler colonial North American contexts. But to ask you to kind of reflect on a different term, which is, I think, a term that we've used more in this group and perhaps is more often directly connected in some at least conceptual conversations around the commons, which is enclosure.
Enclosures as a vocabulary of description and critique emerges predominantly because of the Enclosure Acts, right? And so from there, it enters into those Marxist debates. And so E.P. Thompson and the Midnight Notes Collective and all of that kind of work. And that makes a great deal of sense to me because of the very specific kind of like legal mechanism by which these essentially forms of primitive accumulation took place in Western Europe, but especially in Britain. Like they were literally enclosure acts and enclosures in a sort of literal and kind of legal technical sense, right? I do not hear indigenous peoples in North America use the language of enclosures a great deal. And I think that's partially just the different histories but also the different kind of like legal mechanisms by which these kind of processes take place. So that's a sort of like superficial answer, or not superficial, but like has to do with the semantics of it. That there's just the parlance of the contemporary movements is, I think, less connected to questions of enclosures. Although maybe there are, ways in which that's not entirely true, or not. Maybe I just need to keep looking for more people who use that language. The deeper kind of answer, I think, and I'm still kind of grappling a little bit with this myself. It's still sort of a living question for me. Is the way that enclosures is clearly a spatial metaphor, and it is a spatial metaphor that, because it's a spatial metaphor, in one sense is, I think, quite useful, right? But in another sense, it tends to obscure at least one important aspect of this issue, which I am trying to think through. And I've been thinking about it, if you'll kind of indulge me a little bit, a bit of a kind of metaphor, a little bit of a parable or something, that when I think of enclosures, I think about, so someone kind of like putting up, let's say, 4 walls. And when they're putting up 4 walls, that what they're doing is creating an interior space. And imagine the person is sort of inside of the 4 walls that they put up. So they see themselves as putting up an interior space, and the negative space left outside is the outside, right? But if you think about it a different way, when a person puts up 4 walls, they are enclosing themselves, but they're also enclosing the rest of the earth. Like there are 2 interior spaces, one that is the size of a house and one that is the size of the rest of the earth. And it's the way in which Europeans, as they begin to understand territory or sovereignty as territorially bounded, they are enclosing in England, but in that moment also already enclosing the rest of the earth, because by in relief, the rest of the earth is now increasingly in a de facto position of exclusive enclosure. And it's that I think is the more important dilemma, right? Which is that's kind of part of my story. And so, because indigenous peoples find themselves, as more and more Europeans arrive, and the Europeans are like enclosing themselves and creating like interior spaces, so to speak, the indigenous peoples are saying, we do not hold the earth in this form of exclusive kind of territorial bounded space. But they find themselves increasingly in smaller and smaller plots of land, until one day they find themselves in an open space the size of a house, if you see what I mean. Like the whole rest of the earth has been enclosed such that they are de facto now also in an enclosure. And that's the problem that I'm trying to think through, is how it puts them in a kind of paradoxical position with regard to their critique of it, because they look like they're saying, we do not hold space in an exclusive bounded sense, but we must defend it as if it were an exclusive bounded sense, because we have been driven into that position by the enclosures that other people have been doing. And so to me, that's the central problem of like enclosure, not as a grammar, but as like an actual phenomenon, that it drives other people into a kind of de facto form of enclosure themselves, even as they try to resist it. And that's part of my story, because I think that's part of like the origins of the dilemma of dispossession, is that you have to kind of use the vocabulary of exclusive proprietary control precisely to critique being driven into a position of exclusive proprietary control.
One thing I'm thinking about and worried about is how our economy is changing due to the use of personal digital data and information for large kinds of firms. and the way they use that data to make profits. There's increasing talk around this and questions and philosophical works on whether or not we have property in our data. There's an attempt to kind of propertize data, and then there's a backlash from people who are relatively pro large tech firms like Facebook, et cetera, to say, no, these firms actually can have this data because they've sort of acquired it in the right way. They've gotten your consent and so on and so forth. And I was wondering whether you thought this could be another case of property generating theft. Precisely because it's not until we start having these firms using this data for the means of profit that any of us started thinking about this in terms of property at all. Moreover, there was a certain resonance with the idea that it's only negatively defined. So, what else can we do with our data other than, I guess, kind of sell it? I mean, so anyways, this is sort of where my head went. And I was just sort of wondering whether you had any thoughts about analogies or disanalogies here that might be helpful.
Thank you. Yeah, I have had kind of conversations with people who are doing work of this sort, who have found kind of important resonances. And I'm pretty convinced that that is one context where there is, I think, pretty clear resonances, because exactly as you say, that like, I do think increasingly on that terrain that people find that they are losing things that they didn't think of as something they had to begin with, and where you can actually be subject to a form of theft over a thing which you never claimed in the first instance to have as property. And initially we think that that's because it's kind of like a case of you don't almost like having something that you take for granted. So the case of it kind of like being taken for granted is the idea that you didn't know what you had until you lost it, kind of thing, right? But I think that what you're describing is almost the opposite. It's not that people like overlook these things because they don't value them enough, but because they're so embedded in our form of life, they can't be cognized as a kind of object that could be in principle detached from the person or the form of life until such a moment as they've already lost it. And then in retrospect, you have to construe yourself as if you were the original owner of it in order to take it back, right? And so it's that kind of disembedding process that comes with the propertyization logic that is being resisted in this. And I find that pretty convincing with some of these things where the making and taking of property are fused in one instance, that the turning it into an object of property, a kind of juridical object in which rights can be invested, takes place simultaneously to the systematic divestment of the newly generated property object from one party to another. That seems to me to be kind of like paradigmatically a case of dispossession in the sense that I'm talking about it. The only hesitation I have about that is where you ended with the language of like analogy. I'm a little kind of hesitant a bit about thinking about those things as like analogs of, let's say, indigenous dispossession and colonization, partially for kind of like political reasons, but also more for like conceptual reasons, that I would resist calling them analogous to one another because I see them as being nested in a series of causal relations. So it's not that it's like analogous to forms of colonization, but rather that the first wave of what I'm calling dispossession of, say, landed property in the context of English colonization in the Americas, establishes a context, a legal and political context within which the second wave comes. And so it's nested within a series of like historical successive waves. And one, I think, needs to think a little bit more about how colonial dispossession establishes a world within which other forms of dispossession may take place. That metaphor of like causally nested sequences is to me different than the language of analogy, which makes it seem as if on that in the language of analogy, we are to property rights as indigenous people are to landed rights. And I think that's a bit misleading, and effaces the causal connections between these different waves.
When I was reading your genealogical inquiry of property and showing the original theft that produces the property, and the theft itself is being concealed in the process, I was thinking it analogical to the formation of liberal state that conceals the violence. So in a Benjaminian way, perhaps, the extra legal violence that underwrites the political legal system. Right, order. So I was thinking whether you could also be able to put property in conversation with sovereignty through this analogical thinking, if I'm following correctly. I'm really excited about the conversation, the unmediated conversation, using your words, that you construct between indigenous political thinking and practices and radical Black political thought, especially in its feminist material version. And I wonder what kind of, there are a lot of potentials there, and I think you excavate them really nicely in the book. I wonder what kind of challenges that unmediated conversation also inhabits.
So the first question, yeah, I take it to be a question kind of about sovereignty as maybe embodying an analogous form of this recursive logic in which produces its own presuppositions. Yeah, I do think that there is something really resonant with that in a lot of work in European political thought, which has focused on those kinds of questions, including Benjamin, obviously. The closest analogy I can think of is long-standing debates, extending all the way back to, say, Hobbes, where the question of the relationship between the sovereign and the people. So the one version of it is something like that in our kind of mythos of sovereignty and nationhood, is that the people found the state and constitute it as a regime by authorizing themselves through something like a Declaration of Independence. And the alternative interpretation, kind of sometimes ascribed to Hobbes, is that it is the sovereign who actually constitutes the people, and it works the other way around, or at the very least, there's a kind of recursive relationship between the two, that the people in whose name sovereignty is invested are actually retroactively constituted through the imposition of law and its kind of coercive authority, right? So it's not a linear relation, but rather a recursive one, or a circular one of some sort. I think that there's something really important and interesting about that. And I agree kind of at the formal level in terms of the linear versus recursive, there are some similarities. There's a specific reason why a lot of people ask me why the book doesn't talk more about sovereignty, because especially in indigenous studies, questions of sovereignty and nationhood have historically played a really important role in a big part of that vocabulary. Plus there is this connection to European thought that you pointed out. The reason, I think, has to do with the specific phenomenon that I'm describing, which is not just that kind of property and property-esque language is a really important vocabulary for the present, but that at the actual level of the mechanics of it, I think, at least in a certain strand of indigenous studies and kind of settler colonial studies, there's been an overemphasis on property, or on sovereignty, and an underemphasis on political economy, if I can put it bluntly. So a lot of work understands colonialism to be a process of asserting sovereignty, where Europeans make big sweeping claims to all of North America or something like that. So the moment of colonization comes in the actual assertion of sovereignty. I'm much less interested in assertions of sovereignty, because Europeans make wild, outrageous, sweeping claims all the time over things. But what matters is when they can actualize those claims, when they can make good on them. And at least where I'm from, in Northern Canada, Indigenous peoples were not even forcibly relocated into permanent settlements until after the Second World War. These people still, in many ways, continue to live through forms of traditional and subsistence economies and whatnot, and they continue to practice kind of beneath and below the aegis of the formal state, alternative forms of life, that they just simply just don't care what, the Canadian state makes all kinds of big claims about them. What matters, in my view, is when the political economy is destroyed and restructured such that those communities become market dependent, so that then they cannot actually, in a very literal way, cannot feed themselves until they are able to commoditize the world around them and sell it onto a world market, and that draws them into this. And that's a transition moment, becoming market dependent, that is, to me, like really, really important and actualizes the sovereignty claims of the state. In other words, it's property that makes the state, not the state that makes property. Now, that's often concealed within European discussions, because European discussions tend to take the emergence of the transition from the feudal state to the modern state, and assume that because the state already existed there, right? That there was already a French state before it went through a process of transitioning into capitalism. And so the question is how it transformed from one form of state to another. But in the North American continent, there simply was no state that was organizing and orchestrating this, or the state was in a very dynamic and fluid relationship with a whole variety of sub-state and non-state actors, including squatters and homesteaders and farmers and whatnot, who were taking on quasi-state-like roles, but were not kind of acting in the formal capacity of the state. That's a very different historical story than the European context. And so the intuitive relationship between sovereignty and property, whereby the state decides internally how to partition its property relations, is very different in a North American colonial context, where paradoxically private property relations actually generate and inform the form that the state eventually takes. Your second question was about, the dangers of putting the direct conversation between, say, Black radical tradition and Indigenous politics. They have to fight so much for space in the academy and in public discourse for themselves, that they often end up getting positioned vis-a-vis kind of dominant intellectual tradition. So, there's conversation between the Black tradition and Marxism, or between Indigenous peoples and liberalism or whatnot, but not between Indigenous politics and the Black radical tradition. That conversation is kind of less often staged, in part because both of those communities and those traditions have to spend so much time just fighting for airtime of their own before they can get to the kind of question of how to think through their interactions. That said, there's nothing totally new about this. There's nothing new about what I'm doing. I'm trying to just kind of recover in some ways a very long-standing thing. If you look back to all that work in the 19th century, like, this is a subtext of a lot of that work already. It's just that it kind of gets reified into a different sort of conversation later on. So part of what I'm trying to do is to take it out of the more zero-sum game that it has become increasingly in the 20th century, and in a way to recover some of that real complexity, that where at a moment in time, the 19th century is a moment in time in which the very categories of Indigenous and Black are themselves highly fluid and not mutually exclusive, and deeply contested and contestable. By the mid 20th century, those things seem to be stabilized in such a way as to appear to be mutually incompatible, or at least logically distinct trajectories. And so part of what I'm trying to do is kind of like recover the history of the interlapping and intersecting kind of conversations that produced those categories in the first place.
We were talking about enclosure, and you said something about it matters to you not as a grammar, but as an actual phenomenon. But it also struck me that you were really laying out something that could be described in other ways. And then in a way, the grammar has to be there to understand what that process you were describing as an enclosure, as opposed to an imprisonment or some other kind of thing. And so I guess it's just an invitation for you to talk about it as a writer, but also maybe as a political thinker. What's the relation of these kind of terms to, political thinking, but also political action?
What I'm actually concerned with is not so much dispossession as an empirical phenomenon that occurred in the world. Not because there isn't like an empirical phenomenon that occurred in the world, but that to observe that empirical phenomenon requires that one bring to bear some conceptual vocabulary in order to elucidate what feature of it is relevant and pertinent to our problem in the present. And so it requires bringing some conceptual framework to bear upon that empirical phenomenon. And really what I'm concerned with is how the empirical processes, all these kind of complex processes, came to be viewed as if they were a case of dispossession. Because there would have been other ways, of course, to describe the same empirical phenomena. And what I'm interested in is the as if character of that, right? That it becomes dispossession retroactively. And the fact that it becomes dispossession for us is symptomatic of something about the process, because the process under description is one in which a vocabulary of property increasingly comes to dominate and frame our understanding of power and historical processes, so that we come retroactively to interpret the process under description through a property language, which is both apt, but also begging the question, if you see what I mean. And that's why it's recursive, and so that's the phenomenon I'm kind of like most interested in studying, in a sense, is what I say is kind of like the recursive relationship between historical processes and the concepts used to describe and critique them, that they aren't like linear in their relationship.
Ivan, I guess I wondered about the role of this, the way you think about academic writing, and then in relation to these struggles, I suppose. And I was just thinking a lot about, I don't know, some of the genres of politically engaged scholarship, or even genres like the land acknowledgement in academic contexts and others, and just what your thoughts are about the sort of political role of this kind of writing, or conversely, just the role of language in the political movements themselves.
So a lot of political theorists, of course, would think that the natural thing to do would be to try to write like the theory of dispossession. So you would start in a very kind of like analytic mode of laying out your initial premises, and then kind of building from that until at some point you end up with like the theory of dispossession. And so a lot of people, when they read the book, a lot of political theorists, when they read the book, assume that it's kind of strangely worded, because at no point is it entirely clear whether I'm saying like, this is my theory of dispossession, and I'm trying to like assert how people should use the word. And like, so it's prescriptive, and I'm saying like, this is the way we should be using the word, and we've been using it in all this kind of like muddled nonsense ways. And so I'm trying to like clear away the false in order to like clarify and then like assert a proper way of using the term. And of course, that's not what I'm trying to do, right? What I'm trying to, it begins actually with a kind of a quasi-empirical observation, which is simply that people are using the word. And so the question isn't like, it's not, I'm not trying to be like the language police and say like, this is the right way to use it, but rather I'm trying to ask, why are they using the word? Like, what motivates that? And my intuition about that is that it's motivated from contradictory desires or contradictory impulses embedded within social struggles, namely the desire to both avail oneself of the language of property, but also to critique the language of property, that because this is kind of embedded within those social struggles, that the term dispossession is symptomatic of a broader set of contradictory processes that these political movements are responding to. So my aim is not so much to like offer people the theory of dispossession, but rather to offer a kind of diagnostic of the process that leads them into the impasse that they themselves find themselves driven into, with the hope that the process of clarifying that is itself politically useful. So not that I'm kind of like prescriptively telling them how to solve the problem, but that the process of elucidating and narrating the problem back to them will be clarifying in a way to allow them to move beyond the impasse that they find themselves in through their use of the term, or and the unavoidability, the inescapability of that kind of vocabulary. Not that it's like a tool that one can pick up and put down, but it's kind of like a world within which we live, and that we cannot completely evade by simply finding another word, because it's symptomatic of the broader political problem which we find ourselves embedded in. And so that's why I do see kind of political theory as being belated, in the sense of like always kind of coming after the fact and trying to elucidate the conditions under which the conceptual problematic arose in the first place, rather than being prescriptive in that forward-looking thing of like, well, once I tell everybody how to use the word, then from then on, we'll all just have our terms stabilized and we'll solve the problem. But that is how like lots of political theorists think of what they're doing. That's the, you know, sort of the strong analytic influence on political theory.
I was really appreciative of the way in the later part of the book that you try to speak about dispossession as in dispossession of oneself. So we talked about slavery as dispossession, and you know, the dispossession of through colonialism. So there did seem to be like a lot of conceptual sort of similarities between those two modes of dispossession, and I was wondering how, I guess just broadly, if you could speak more about that. Thank you.
One thing to, at least for in my own head, that I find like useful for clarifying these things is very hard. It does go a little bit to the question, David's question that just preceded, but it's very hard both in writing, but especially orally, to make a distinction between two different things we're referring to when we're referring to land or a self. It's hard to make this distinction in writing without continuously putting quotation marks around one of them and not the other. And orally, it's even harder, other than, you know, constantly making little bunny ears around your head. The point being, right, that sometimes when we're talking about land, we're talking about this really kind of complex, messy, like empirical phenomenon upon which there are layered all kinds of different interpretations and meanings of what it is and what its value is and what its worth is. So sometimes it's a kind of cipher for a complex set of contested meanings and negotiations. So let's reserve the word land in one sense for the repository of various interpretations, right? And then sometimes when we're talking about land in the kind of around quotations, we're talking about a juridical object, one interpretation of the first thing, which comes to be the repository of legal rights, which are enforceable under a particular kind of regime, right? So the point is that land becomes the object, land in the second sense becomes the object around which the struggle gravitates. Land as an object of property and as a juridical object becomes the object of struggle. That half the game is already lost when that happens. When once land becomes the thing around which we're struggling, then we've already structured the struggle in a particular way. And the second question of like who owns it or who doesn't is subsidiary to the primary question, which is like, what is the thing in question? What is the object over which we are struggling? Once it becomes a juridical object and commercial object, it can be sort of bought and sold on a market, then already half the process has taken place, right? And by analogy, the point about like the self is similar, right? There's a sort of self in a kind of most capacious sense is this, you know, really, you know, deeply contested and difficult, complex, messy, ongoing process of trying to think about what is a human being and what is a self. But that's different from the question of like when the self as a juridical subject, right? As a subject of law in which there is a kind of, it becomes a repository for enforceable rights. And it can only be that thing because there's something else all around it, namely a state and a legal mechanism that can enforce and make meaningful these claims. So the point, right, what in the question around like the Black radical tradition has to do with how the self in the second sense becomes a repository of property and property-like kinds of claims, and how that already changes the register of struggle. Now we're struggling over ourselves as juridical subjects with kind of property-like claims embedded within us. And that's already kind of half the game has already been lost if we if we don't observe that transition, that it's a sort of restricting of that capacious notion of self down to a specific interpretation of it invested with specific legal and political powers, right? And I think that a lot of people in the Black radical tradition are very alive to that problem and very alive to it, right? Especially alive to it, because if you're a group of people who historically speaking have been denied the self in the juridical sense, then it makes sense that you would have extremely contradictory responses to the process of becoming a self in the juridical sense. On the one hand, it seems like it's a nominal gain over not having any recognition as a juridical self. Well, that seems like obviously an improvement over the condition of slavery. But on the other hand, it clearly alters the register of struggle. It becomes then increasingly a struggle over the self in that juridical sense, and particularly as a repository of property rights. A lot of people would normally say, well, why would Europeans have cared to ascribe property rights to indigenous peoples at all? Why not just continue the practice of like denying them any property rights? It's like, well, it's because the ascription of property rights increasingly becomes part of this, the rise of a kind of, I think in particular, kind of like liberal understanding of power, in which power only is authorized to over such people if they themselves consent to it. So it has to go through this kind of increasingly elaborate mechanism of ascribing rights so that they can be self-extinguished, if you see what I mean. And so that's my point about the story of the relationship between indigenous and Black political thought, is not that they're like isolated parallel stories, but that they're stories that exist in the same time space of different communities experiencing the same phenomenon, just in different registers.
I was wondering if you could speak specifically to this concept of anti-will, or the ritual of anti-will, which I think is comes from Patricia Williams, and how, sort of taking up where you just left off in your comments, how this idea of anti-will sort of completes the broader analysis of the book.
That whole generation of Black feminist thinkers often came up, I think, not kind of coincidentally, through law. And so they're really interested in kind of like the empirical mechanics of like how this actually works in practice, rather than, if I can kind of like self-critique, they're not like political philosophers, right? So they don't start with the question of like, in an ideal world, what would be the best way of thinking about, should we have property in the person or should we not? They're interested more in like, how does it work? Not kind of like, is it right or wrong, but like, what is it, the relative merits of this, or what is the comparative difference it makes to understand politics through this particular legal mechanism or not. And the thing that I feel like I learned a great deal from that tradition, especially kind of feminist traditions, and the Black feminist thinkers that I draw upon like are most useful for this, but there's lots of other feminists who have thought a great deal about this, is the paradoxical nature of consent, right? Because what's happening in the world, kind of broadly speaking, over the course of the 19th century is that power is increasingly authorized through consent. And obviously on first glance, that seems like a good thing, right? We should want that power is only legitimized and authorized when those who are subject to it give consent to it. That seems to be like a positive thing. But what they are so good at pointing at is that if that's true, then it matters a lot how people give consent. Like, what is the exact literal mechanism by which consent is registered and made legible, and what are the consent making practices, right? And what they, I think, notice is that in a range of different kinds of legal and political contexts, women, but probably especially Black women, they are recognized as consenting subjects, that subjects capable of giving consent. But the circumstances within which they find themselves are so constrained that their consent is like unidirectional. it's not bimodal, that in effect, they can never say no. They're sort of funneled into circumstances where they can only say yes, as they can only give consent to power being subjected to them because of the kind of increasingly constrained conditions under which their consent is made legible. That is a kind of weaponizing of their will, right? It's like it's not saying these people have no will. It's saying they do have will, but their will is only legible to power as an acceptance of power and an acceptance of their subjection. And that's what Patricia Williams calls anti-will, like not non-will, right? But anti-will, as in kind of like using will against oneself.
I was starting to wonder whether you thought property was sort of special here, or whether or not other kinds of rights may face a similar kind of problem.
My first inclination is to want to insist that property is a particular and distinct problem which can't be too quickly analogized to other kinds of legal grammars and forms of rights for two main reasons. And maybe I've read maybe this is Marx is like talking in the back of my head here, but so the first is that property, a right to property or a property right isn't just a species of rights. It's not like we have rights to life, liberty, and property, because historically speaking, our right to life, liberty, freedom of association, conscience, and so on is an extension of a prior claim of property, namely the property in one's person, right? So that's what makes it kind of like, at least in terms of like the history of political thought, a special kind of right is not that property is a subspecies of the more general category of rights, but that rights are a species of property, that all forms of rights are an extension of an original claim to have some kind of like ownership over oneself. But the other, I think, in a more important reason, and one of the reasons why I focus on property in particular in the book, is that a property isn't just like a juridical object. So it doesn't just engage questions of law. It is also a commercial object. It connects to markets. And so it's really important for generating capital. And that is important for building power. And so it is big part of the story. So sometimes when people do kind of studies around like settler colonialism, they'll say like, oh, there's an indigenous community that has its different kind of configuration of property or non-property or whatever, however they understand these relationships. And then there's this kind of European or English speaking colonial regime, which have this very specific configuration of right. And so what we're trying to do is kind of like compare these two different ways of configuring these relationships. That's important, and that, you know, there's nothing to be said that a person shouldn't do that. But I'm not just concerned with what English colonizers thought. I'm concerned with how they were able to make good on their claims. Not just that they claimed they had right in land, but that they were able to build capacity and power through that in such a way as to effectively displace and destroy rival visions of land. And that's a question about building power. And that's why I think property is particularly important, because it anchors the eventual fungibility and marketization of land, which is central to building capacity in the sense of moving, both like generating capital, but also moving populations of people around. That, you know, you can entice tons of Europeans to come with the promise that they will have some kind of secure claim in land afterward. So property is, to me, a key category in the mediation between state and market, or between law and capital. It's not just a kind of juridical object, it's also a commercial, it's a commodity. And so that makes it also, I think, qualitatively distinct and really important for understanding the story, if your goal is to not merely understand different theories of land, but to understand the political economy by which one theory of land came to displace another.
Robert, thank you so much, really, for the book, for the conversation, for the clarity, for the provocation. Really, it's been a really fantastic read and discussion. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate both the invitation and also the level of engagement. And like I said, I mean, often you don't really know what you have written until you hear it narrated back to you from other people. So it's a big part of learning process for me too. So I really appreciate this.